All right, sports fans, how's everybody out there doing? William Martin coming at you one more time here on YouTube with another edition of the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast. Now, today, the Big 12 school presidents and chancellors voted unanimously to accept BYU, Houston, UCF, and Cincinnati into the fray as members. Now, this move comes several weeks after it was announced that Texas and Oklahoma would be leaving the Big 12 for the SEC. Now, the Big 12 was on the brink of extinction following the departures of Texas and Oklahoma, but they've been brought back to life through not only their agreement with the Pac 12 and the Big 10, but also their ability now to add more schools to give them, more power and more relevance. And I think it was so big for the Big 12 to come to that agreement with the Big 10 and the Pac 12 because it's a situation where now they're going to have an opportunity to, go out there and compete. And then on top of that, they don't have to worry about these mega conferences going out there and poaching them more than they already had been. So you look at this move right now as far as what it means for the Big 12. First and foremost, they're now going to have 12 schools in order to have that traditional conference game. Remember, following, the departure of, Colorado to the Pac-10, and now, of course, Pac-12, Nebraska to the Big Ten, and, of course, Missouri and Texas A&M to the ACC, pardon me, the SEC, rather. And then we saw the Big 12 add TCU and West Virginia. They had 10 clubs, but it was a situation where they had to get a waiver from the NCAA in order to do it. Now they're going to be able to have that traditional 12-team league where you can break it down into multiple divisions and then have your traditional conference championship game that we've been accustomed to now for nearly 30 years. But you look at it and you see what it means for the new Big 12 schools. First and foremost, Houston, they've been trying to get into the Big 12 conference for the longest time. I remember Houston was once upon a time a member of the very powerful Southwest Conference. And, when that conference dissolved in the mid 90s, Houston was one of those schools like TCU that kind of got lost in the fray. We saw Texas, we saw Baylor, we saw Texas Tech and Texas A&M, go to the Big 12 conference, and they just kept going. Uh, but Houston was one of those schools that got lost into the fray. They tried to get into the Big 12 a couple of years ago. They had some pushback due to the fact that there were some schools, non-Texas schools in the Big 12, that didn't want to compete with another Texas school based on recruiting. That's no longer the case. So I think Houston, will definitely benefit from that. I look at Cincinnati and UCF. Both of these guys, they've been two of the top programs in the American Athletic Conference. And now this gives them an opportunity to get some more respectability. And if you look at what Cincinnati has done, in recent years, and this goes back to even before they were in the American, going back to their time in the Big East, with the likes of Butch Jones once upon a time, or Brian Kelly once upon a time as a head coach, and now, of course, Luke Fickell. It's a program that you really have to respect and you really have to pay attention to. So with that said, I think they both benefit. I look at UCF. We've seen the dominance that UCF has had. You saw that long winning streak, rather, that they had a couple of seasons ago, and now they get more relevant. And I think for Houston, I think for Central Florida, and definitely for Cincinnati, it's a situation where they don't have to worry as much as far as losing their head coach to a bigger program, especially from Central Florida. Josh Heupel just left to take the Tennessee job. Enter Gus Malzahn, the former Auburn coach. And, there are those who felt like, what, maybe Malzahn could, have one or two good years at UCF and he's back to a Power Five conference. I think that changes that. A guy like Luke Fickell, I think he's been looked over several times for a bigger job. Now, I don't think you have to worry about that as much if you're Cincinnati because he's going to realize he's in a power conference. Not only that, but for all of these teams, it's more money, and it's going to be an opportunity for them to improve all of their facilities So it's going to make these programs not only more enticing to their coaches, but also to recruits. Houston, I look at them from the standpoint not only from getting back into the fray as far as being a Texas school and being now a member of the Big 12, but also getting back to some of those natural rivalries that we saw with them many moons ago in the old Southwest Conference. And you think about the Southwest Conference, once upon a time, with the exception of Arkansas, all of the teams in that conference called the state of Texas home. And now you're going to have Houston back in the conference with Texas Tech, back in the conference with TCU, back in the conference with Baylor. Of course, it's not a situation where Texas A&M, and Rice are there, but nonetheless, it's a situation where Houston can definitely get back to that. So I think they benefit from it. BYU is a program, they're going to succeed wherever they're at. I mean, we've seen BYU have success in the old Western Athletic Conference, the Mountain West Conference, most recently as a football independent. And from BYU's standpoint, they had the opportunity to sit back and dictate things because they left the Mountain West over money. They became a football independent. They were a part of the West Coast Conference and all other sports. But now it's an opportunity for them, to get a bigger piece of the pie, obviously. And I think they're set up for success. So you look at it, hypothetically speaking, obviously I don't have a seat at the table, but I could imagine that the Big 12 goes back to the North South divisional bracket breakdown like they had once upon a time. And if the Big 12 were to do that, I could see a situation where you have BYU, Kansas, Cincinnati, Iowa State, K-State, and West Virginia in the North, while you'd have Houston, Texas Tech, TCU, Baylor, UCF, and Oklahoma State in the South. And of course, putting all of those Texas schools in the South would then, set up, all of those, in-state rivalries, like I said, that we saw once upon a time in the Southwest Conference. So you ask yourself, how does the Big 12 now stack up against the other Power Five conferences? Football wise, obviously, this is what this move was about. The SEC is still head and shoulders above everybody else. The Big Ten is right there. And then it's the ACC and Pac 12. And I mean, it's a situation where the ACC is a Power Five conference, but, it's been dominated by Clemson for the last, nearly a decade. And before that, it was Florida State. So you look at it, from top to bottom, the ACC isn't as strong as people want you to think it is. And I mean, just look at what happened to them last week in the first full weekend of college football. The Pac 12 is really taking it on the chin. They're not as powerful and dominant as they once were. They do have the potential to get better, obviously. So it's a situation where you could say, you know what? The Big 12 really isn't that far off. You look at what Iowa State has become on the gridiron under Matt Campbell. You look at what TCU has done under Gary Patterson since they've joined the Big 12 conference. You look at Oklahoma State with Mike Gundy. Baylor is improving. And I think, Houston and UCF and Cincinnati and BYU have an opportunity to go in there and compete not only for respectability, but compete for a Big 12 championship from day one. So on the flip side, you look at the American Athletic Conference, a conference that has gotten poached in all of this. And, theoretically speaking, you look at some of the schools that have left the AAC, you can throw Louisville and Rutgers into that mix. I know that they weren't there for that long. They were there for a cup of coffee because they were former Big East schools, just taking care of things until their invitations for their new respective conferences were taken care of. Of course, Louisville's now in the ACC, and Rutgers is in the Big Ten. But now UConn left to become an independent and for football, and they're in the Big East Conference for all of the sports. But now you've lost UCF, Cincinnati, and Houston, and that's a gut punch for the American. But I think just like it was with the former Big East Conference, you're going to see the AAC continue to raid Conference USA and the Sun Belt. And I look at teams like Florida Atlantic, Louisiana Tech. I know there's talks of Boise State, even Appalachian State and Coastal Carolina. I think all of these programs could be in the mix to get invites from the American as they look to stay afloat. Of course, obviously, they're not a Power Five conference, they're a part of that group of five. But now you're just down to eight programs. So it's going to be interesting to see what they do. You still have Memphis. Memphis is a solid football program. And you still have SMU, who is on the rise under head coach Sonny Dykes. So, there is something there, but I definitely think that the American will reach out to Florida Atlantic to get another Florida school into the fray. And then you can also have a situation where, you have that in-state rivalry, just like you had with UCF and USF, to bring Florida Atlantic into that fray. So we'll see what happens. But I think the AAC will be able to survive. They've rolled with the punches before. And, this round of realignment in college football was not as vast as it was the first time around, but that was a big shockwave with Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12 for the SEC. But I mean, we saw what happened before, how so many schools were affected. You think about, what the dominoes got going the first time around when Nebraska left the Big 12 for the Big 10. Then it was Colorado going to the Pac 12. Next, Utah left the Mountain West for the Pac 12. Then we saw, the ACC go up and raid the Big East. So it's not as drastic, but I still think it's very impactful. And you think about things heading forward with the potential expansion of the college football playoff. The Big 12 is looking to strengthen their position in that, and they definitely don't want to get lost in the fray. So I think everybody at the programs that are joining the new Big 12 conference. They definitely stand to benefit this from so many different ways. Of course, financially, because the Big 12 is going to give those AAC schools a bigger and better football payout. And that's what it all comes down to. These programs are looking to protect themselves, especially in this new era of name, image, and likeness. So it was something that was inevitable, but it's all about rolling with the punches. It's all about adjusting and adapting. And the bottom line is this: when it comes down to collegiate athletics are no different from any other business. Notice I said business. And that is a situation where, these guys are always going to look for the top dollar. And I think it's important that the NCAA and these programs are starting to recognize the business factor, because these kids definitely deserve to get paid. But nonetheless, they are going to look to see how they can protect their bottom line. They're going to see how they can improve their dollars, because it makes sense to them, if you know what I mean. So this move was not as big of a shocker as most people expected. I expected something to happen once the Big 12 reached that agreement. And now it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward. But I think Cincinnati, UCF, Houston, and BYU are all in position to have some success in the new Big 12 conference. So, folks, that is going to wrap it up. And as always, I want to take this time out to thank you for tuning into the 300 Pounds of Sports Knowledge podcast here on YouTube. I want to take the time out to thank all of you fine folks out there for tuning in. And if you have not already, please feel free to subscribe to this channel. Now, if you're on Twitter, please feel free to follow me at 300 Pounds of Sports. And like I always say, if you follow me, it'll be my pleasure to follow you right back. There's also the sports discussion group on Facebook at the Sports Depot 365. You can check it out, drop a line, and be a part of one of the better sports debating sites going on social media. So once again, fine folks, my name is William Martin, signing off, saying take care and have yourselves a wonderful day.